a lot of this is grappling with the ideas of truth and freedom, um, and also like the sterilization of subculture and divergent thoughts through media, through state and private and self-censorship, all these different kinds of censorship. But just tying this back to people with disabilities, Kay Inkle wrote in Subcultures, Bodies, and Spaces essays on alternativity and marginalization. She said, quote, "Despite sociology having an ethos of social justice and frequently producing critical accounts of inequalities, such as anti-racism and gender equality, it nonetheless uncritically reiterates the marginalization of disability and distress." So, discrimination, if we make that the number one issue, it's keeping people in this relationship where they're different than other people versus seeing people for who they are. And it's not to say we should be colorblind. I think we need to recognize race and gender and acknowledge those things, but do it in a more thoughtful way so we don't fall into these traps of classism and virtue signaling. But Kay Inkle went on to say, as such, sociology not only reflects the increasing medicalization of everyday life and shores up the essentialist discourses of genetics and neuroscience, but it also consigns research and knowledge production about disability and distress to the medical sciences. She challenges these sociological conventions and highlights the ways in which both disability and distress are socially structured embodied experiences. So this idea of, people have a medical diagnosis or, they're different. A lot of this difference is socially constructed. So Inkle also argues that a sociological account of distress and disability are important not only in and of themselves, but also because they highlight the ways and means to challenge the status quo. So some of this reminds me of what we talked about, I think off camera, but about this idea of queer justice or crip justice, highlighting difference as a badge of honor rather than coming from this medicalized shame and categories that are based in biology, but really all of this deals with the mind and these socially constructed views, these hegemonic views on essentialism, and does infotainment play a role in upholding that or moving us away from these ideas, seeing people apart from their ideas, apart from their speech, instead of jumping to conclusions based on, a snippet of something that they say. So I think these are just all interesting things to think about, but I think we can get into some of these critical questions on part 4. But if you had any questions on that additional research I did, feel free to ask me. But for part 4, Who is the most important character? I said it was the students that were seeking to reshape the power structures. They need to learn how to engage with them instead of being in this environment where they're shielded from views that aren't their own. What is the most important action or consequence? I said safe spaces should and must avoid pernicious discrimination based on protected criteria such as race, gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So again, safe spaces was called out in this part of the research. What was the role or influence of the media in the public discourse? And we talked a little bit about infotainment, but the media really reinforcing what we view as politically correct is what I said. Who's responsible? This language of calling out people, it can't be left to the members of these marginalized groups in regard to discrimination, but I think if you have a personal connection, like a relative, a family member, or you personally identify, I think that type of authenticity coming from someone who has or identifies in a certain group that's feels there's some form of discrimination, I think it appears more authentic when it comes from a person who's a part of that group. But again, we can't put that all on those groups to fight the whole cause. Who should have won? I said, and this is just from the research, but while some microaggressions or this idea of the language of harm do evince hostility or ignorance, others plainly do not. So knowing what is or isn't, like the Trader Joe's example, is important. I think people need to become more educated so they can form their own opinions on what is or isn't discrimination. Who would benefit? I think anyone who identifies with a subculture or minority group. But I pointed out here that, again, over time, our cultural norms change, and having this tolerant posture on shifting norms is important to being understood. That's the other side of this argument. I said assisting on measures to restore proper protections for free speech and advocating for more stringent measures to address forms of discrimination like sexual harassment and assault, which is referencing that Title IX vagueness. But both are essential. So it's really striking a balance when you're talking about the other side of these arguments. What is the point of free speech? Our First Amendment. I put, instead of condemning speech, we can support it while we push the institutions to become more inclusive and welcoming to all. And I put a reference here into that Yale letter on the Halloween costumes that we talked about in part 2. When do guest speakers become a problem? So this is more when they hold a controversial belief or they have a certain association with a statement that was made, especially as they're highlighted through the media. But in regards to part 4 of this research, I thought organizations could benefit from having some of these guidelines from the research as it relates to their role of purchasing power and supporting businesses that maybe donate to political parties that are against your personal values. to like Chick-fil-A, for instance. I know some people didn't like that they funded certain ideological campaigns, but putting that purchasing power in the hands of the individual, I think, is important to this conversation. And again, the role of humor, I think, is really important too, because that's going to open people up to having a different view of their personal circumstances, or maybe a news story. So I think upholding that comedy and not censoring comedy is really important to inclusion going forward. How or when will we be able to tell if it worked, these things we're doing to advance inclusion? I said, when we have a set of heroic voices again, people aren't painted just as a victim of in response to this mob mentality idea. People have a stronger moral compass. People are more informed about what structural bias is and some of these biological categories, what they see as a disability, moving towards these social models, seeing things as socially constructed, viewing them not as a deficit, but as a boundary object. I think, again, are some important ideas to reemphasize here. So how is this similar to the stigma or exclusion of people with disabilities? I think having institutions that are inclusive and welcoming for all, this is going to support that for any marginalized group. And are there similar situations? I said, are there any examples in the media that you think are negative? And this is more me trying to get some of your input, because I think pop culture does play a role, how people are portrayed in the media who have a disability. I don't know if you have any examples, but feel free to comment. But I think people with intellectual or developmental disabilities can harness some of this information to make organizations more accountable by making calls to the media, putting pressure on key organizations, and through various tactics, have them be more examples and role models for these shifting norms to support inclusion of people with disabilities. So part 5. We talked about it, I think off camera, but talking about the big 5 personality traits. And I want to just pull up that graphic again, because I think it's good for people to familiarize themselves with. Right, these are personality factors that people are going to look at in regards to, do I want to hire someone? Are they going to fit in? Are they going to be able to access that theory of mind so they can abide by a policy or a code the way that it's written? But organizations tend to value people who are more open, more conscientious, right? Less impulsive, or going to do what they want. They tend to value people who are more extroverted and outgoing, and people who are more agreeable, helpful, and trusting. And people who are neurodiverse, that might be challenging for them if they have strong held views based on their autism or something where they don't fit into this box so neatly. Or some people who maybe have a mental health thing going on, they might be a little bit higher in the neuroticism, maybe some more anxiety or proneness to negative emotions. So I think this is a good concept to kind of look at. But let's look at part 5.
Austin, I was going to say something.
Please.
Okay, so, it's kind of harder for people with disabilities, and some of them have mental disabilities, to get a job, and it's hard for them to get a job. It's like I said before, people with disabilities, they start off people with disabilities with a grocery store pushing carts and everything like that. And I know when I did it, I hated it and stuff. And it's not challenging for me, but then it's safer for me to keep up with the job. And it's just, I just saw so many different personalities in my first actual job, that, I worked with all kinds of people from to their 70s to maybe until 16 and stuff. And some people they judge people by how they act and stuff, and not, judge them by the performance, what they're doing and stuff. So it's just the idea of having a job. It's harder to sometimes keep a job too. If you have, especially if you're bipolar, especially, it's harder because you don't know what personality comes out. And so that's all I had to say.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important because this is about inclusion and how we see and understand people for who they are. Because I feel like it's fairly common, and that's maybe courtesy clerks at the grocery store. That's where some of the mainstream public maybe sees people with disabilities in the workforce. And I think that's problematic because there shouldn't just be a handful of jobs where people with disabilities tend to fall into. Society should be more inclusive in other areas, because that's going to advance inclusion more than pigeonholing people and saying, well, if you want to work, you should do this job. This is an easy job. They're not going to, they're less likely to fire you if you have a mental health issue that presents itself on the job. Other organizations, I think, need to be more embracing of that diversity. People who don't fit into the big five, right? They fall on different parts of the spectrum. It's not just on the job, but also in our recruiting practices. How are we, getting diversity and representation through the means through which we acquire talent? These are all important things. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because when I first started at Albertsons, they put me in the gas station, and I didn't know how to count money too well, and I wasn't fast enough. And then I was in the bakery, and then I was left by myself. And then they just said, okay, just start courtesy clerk and see how that goes. But then ended up getting sick because of the weather and stuff. And so I had to quit because I was missing too many days of work because of the snow and all that stuff at the time.
Yeah. So I think that this conversation we're going to have more looking at colleges and universities and how they embrace diversity of thought on campus, I think is important when you look at people going into the workforce, because if younger people start talking and grappling with these issues earlier on, they can see through some of these socially constructed views on diversity when they do enter the workforce and be more of an advocate for diversity and maybe shift the leadership of those organizations to embrace diversity more. Look at part 5 now. They also talked about the role of compensation and emotional intelligence, or EQ, and how if people were more negatively scored on that test, on being able to determine someone's emotions based on facial expressions, that's maybe a predictor that someone has lower empathy, but maybe they just are very empathetic, but they lack the communication skills or the theory of mind to interpret those facial expressions. So neurodiversity is, I think, something to start talking about younger. So people who are in charge of putting different policies in place are aware that they can be less inclusive of diversity in the ways that they're written. So I'll give an example that this is from Jeffrey Miller. I know I've talked about him before, I think the end of part 11, because he had a YouTube video on virtue signaling. And he identifies as on the autism spectrum or having Asperger's. But he said this concept or idea of jokes being unwelcome, or a comment that can be interpreted as sexual being unwelcome for someone who's an Aspie, which is kind of slang for Asperger's brain. To them, that could seem like a time travel paradox. How do I know if something's unwelcome or unwanted until after I say it? So I think having certain speech codes does make a disparate impact on certain minorities, neurominorities, and that is illegal based on the ADA law. And Jeffrey Miller talks about how public institutions maybe need to be held to a different standard. And he kind of says how step by step you can use the ADA policy to try and get an accommodation to set some precedents in this area, and highlights the importance of this because there was a professor that was driven to commit suicide because he felt so alienated based on how, I think it was the Title IX was written, and in regards to his curriculum and how he needs to censor certain things and how he goes about saying things because his students might complain and he could lose his job. So I think that was just an awful outcome. And these are protected classes of people. So I think this idea of neurodiversity is using that to eliminate some of these unconstitutional speech codes on universities. And the article goes on to talk about how students with ADHD would function in regards to the big five again, the neuroticism, like without those self-control aids like Ritalin. So I think these are all important ideas that if there's more accommodations for various groups of people, we can become more inclusive. But I'm saying these things, it's not to be used trivially. It's someone who does have a documented disability can present this case to their university, and the university is then going to have to grapple with 3 irreconcilable laws: the ADA, the First Amendment, and the Title IX, and also reconcile 2 different groups of people: the social justice the social justice activists who demanded the speech codes in the first place, and those neurodivergent students and staff. So I think some work needs to happen in this area, and this is a way to push back maybe against some of this political correctness, because are those activists really ableist in what they are wanting to try to accomplish? But again, it's not to be used in a trivial manner where someone who claims a disability really doesn't have a disability tries to get an accommodation. This is more meant for people who fall under these protected classes. But just to remember, if someone does go this route, is to deal with that stigma they may face. And because of HIPAA, they can maybe keep their name out of the media. But that doesn't save you from that internalized stigma, or maybe you feel like different about yourself. But I think it's important to point out that your difference and your diversity is a badge of honor, and through you speaking up, you're helping everyone else to be more inclusive. So that's kind of what part 5 covered. So kind of getting towards the end here, but getting back to our questions: what was the role or influence of the media in public discourse? I said this arms race perpetuates the affordability gap. Who would benefit? Competitive altruism with an escalation in generosity that is rewarded by the value of altruism as a signal of high quality. So those people that can afford to be altruistic benefit. How would you use this idea of qualitative inclusion, kind of bringing this back to something that like ties all this together? I just said qualitative deals more with the perceived safety and emotional well-being, and we could slide into bias thinking and uphold more state aggression through the words chosen, and the neurotypical perceived safe spaces like social enterprise can hold people down more than promoting a quantitative inclusion. And we talked about screen theory in part 11 and how just representation and more inclusion quantitatively is important, but also balancing that with what Kim Brown said, and she didn't use the exact words, but this idea of tokenism and how people have that whole obstacle to overcome, like Kamala Harris in some ways, the fact that they said they were going to pick a woman for the VP, that kind of makes her a token, and there could have been more power in just picking her for being qualified, not just the fact that she's a woman. So I think these are some complex ideas, but these are all important to this idea of inclusion and making sure that we're not just riding the bandwagon because we think this is the best approach, because it's the new approach. How are we going to really invest and build our communities and put the people in control of their own fate? The last question I had, how is this different from other situations? I said the failure to retaliate is just one way the media and groupthink can miss the point of a protest or detract from the issues at hand. It's the speculative nature of media. So I think that gets back to this idea of media and social media and how all of technology is kind of an experiment, how we're engaging with it to shift these social narratives and advance inclusion or hinder inclusion, and what's the right approach. So it's not super black and white, and I'm not giving you the answers, but I think the research in this series has given some good food for thought, and hopefully we can come up with some good ideas and approaches to advancing inclusion for people who are neurodiverse and all people. So that's kind of the end of my piece. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to share or any thoughts come out of that discussion.
It made me think about how, how this is and everything. I'm gonna say it like this, it got worse when Donald Trump, in my opinion, I felt like it got worse when Donald Trump became in office. And all this white proximity, I can't say that right, the people that are racist towards like black people, it's starting to come out more. So it just made me think like, it's like, and then plus when all this pandemic that happened in these last 4 or 5 months now, it made me think like it's like there's no love in the world anymore, because we have to do social distancing, and it's not like, you gotta be protective of the virus and everything. It's just that there's no humanity anymore. I see a lot of, when you go out in public, you see a lot of fear and a lot of just a lot of stuff that's bad now, and it's not helping that you have to be social distancing, and you just see a lot of fear and a lot of like, it's a lot of more violent to me. That's why I kept thinking, but what I thought about with Donald Trump when he got in office is like, I knew at the back of my mind that it was going to get really bad. And so now we're going into another election this year, and it's when Joe Biden picked what's her name?
Kamala Harris.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And so I think he felt like since I was Obama's, like, you know, I wanted somebody to be different too. It's something that we never tried before. A black lady that's from that's part from India and everything. It's a big change. And when they get, if or whenever they get in office, it's going to, I think it's going to start healing a little bit more better in my thinking. So it just made me think about all of this. I mean, it might have been off topic, but it just made me think about like all of this racism and hurt and everything. And so it's like you can't put a band-aid on it to make it heal. So it's just all this stuff coming on around. But anyway, that's all I gotta say.
Yeah. But I think those are really valid observations. Like what you said about the coronavirus and the social distancing. And I'll bring up Marianne Williamson again, who was on the debate stage before Joe Biden got the nomination. She was talking about reparations for slavery, but she posted something when the social distancing started happening, is that we should really call it physical distancing and call for more social closening. And how can we maybe use technology to bring people together while we maybe need to take more precautions for our health and safety. But I think what you said about Donald Trump and how some of his speech and things that he said has caused some divisiveness and division amongst people. And I think he could increase his awareness of how certain things he says can impact a community and their ability to survive with just speech alone. That's a really powerful tool, and our leaders need to use technology and media responsibly. But I think, you know, this article talked about different forms of government and social coercion and anarchy, and I've seen like anarchy as maybe a space where those social healing experiences can happen more because there's less structure to force people to feel or be or act or say something. And I think all of this socially constructed views on race and ability, all of that needs to be broken down so we can get like a clearer picture of where we're at in society. And it makes me think of this article I saw in Forbes, which we discussed a little bit last week, but this idea of mental health and you know, forcing treatment on someone who has like a mental health diagnosis, and that medicalization of everyday life and how that has a whole fear mentality. And if people are afraid, is that going to cause more chaos than if someone is more strong in their leadership ability to not have people be afraid? Because I think when people are afraid, you get less rational thinking. It's more their gut response and gut instinct. But I think there's no one size fits all solution. But I think what needs to happen is the lifting of those veils and seeing past all of the signaling, all of the speech, and really assessing things from a mindset that isn't afraid. I think that's important. But I did just want to mention briefly, like this article in Forbes magazine, they were talking about mental health and how there's some thought that these mental health things that we are diagnosing are people's adaptive response that maybe just isn't accepted by society, but that it's a natural response to fear or stimulus, and maybe there was a survival instinct that creates that reaction, and now we give people medication to treat those symptoms, but is it more of a, and I just think it should be left up to the individual. Like, I don't think there should be involuntary treatment for mental health issues, especially as data is coming out that's saying that these aren't really medical things that you can really treat with medicine in the first place. It's really, or it's not going to solve, it's not going to cure the mental health. It might help you treat the symptoms, but it's not going to get to the root cause. So I think it deals more with the mind, and through therapy that can be worked out, and I think in combination with medication. Like, I'm not trying to minimize the fact that people need medication and want medication for their anxiety or their PTSD. But I think when the state aggresses to a level where they're forcing you to get certain treatment, that gets problematic. And the censorship associated with that aggression, is that belief acceptable or not? That idea in itself that there hasn't been a decrease of mental health with medication, with the introduction of medication, and that it's not hereditary, it's not something that's passed down, but it's a response to a very chaotic environment, with technology, with media, with all these institutions that are driving some of these responses. And it's society that is not open to that response or that reaction to that fear, to that stimulus. Society has shifted and does not accept that neuroticism or that degree of eccentricity, and does society need to change to embrace more mental health diversity, or do we just keep upping people's medication so they fit in with society as it's evolved? I think those are some other interesting ideas that we can continue to discuss and think about. But this is kind of our last video. We're recording chronologically. We've already done parts 9, 10, 11, and 12. So this has been some good discussion. So thank you. Do you have anything else?
Thanks for watching these part 12 videos. We appreciate it that you tuned in, and hopefully you enjoyed all 12 of our discussions.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, everyone.